Greetings, everyone, on this rainy late afternoon. My name is Michael Suarez. I'm the Executive Director of Rare Book School, and it's my great honor to welcome you to this, the 5th annual Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Annual Lecture on the book trades here at Rare Book School. I'd like to begin with a word or two about our eponymous benefactor. After graduating with a degree in history from the University of California at Santa Barbara, Ken Karmiole worked as a Peace Corps volunteer. Then, returning to Southern California, he earned a master's degree in library science from UCLA. From 1976 until just a few years ago, Ken owned and operated Kenneth Karmiole Bookseller, an antiquarian bookselling firm based in Santa Monica and specializing in early printed books and manuscripts. Certainly, Ken Karmiole has been a prominent bookseller, and a gifted one too. But deep in his core, Ken Karmiole is also a philanthropist, philos anthropos, a lover of humankind, and a person who cares deeply about the stewardship of the historical record in its many forms. The Kenneth Karmiole Endowed Annual Lecture on the Book Trades at Rare Book School is but one of many strategic benefactions that Ken has made, including at Santa Barbara, UCLA, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Book Club of California. In addition to his charitable investments in the world of books, Ken has rendered energetic service to a variety of organizations: the UCLA Research Library Board of Visitors, the Library Council at UCSB, the Advisory Committee of Cal RBS, the Board of Visitors of the UCLA Graduate School of Education and Information Studies, the Directors Advisory Council of the William Andrews Clark Library, the National Board of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, the Book Club of California, and most significantly of all, of course, the Board of Directors of Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. Small wonder, then, that among the many plaudits he has received, Ken has been given the UCLA Library and Information Studies Alumni Association's Distinguished Alumni Award. We who are gathered for this Karmiole lecture are the happy beneficiaries of Ken's largesse. Please join me in thanking Ken. And now for our speaker. Mark McConnell is a retired partner of the global law firm Hogan Lovells, where he was one of the founders of the firm's international trade practice, representing governors and major corporations in international trade disputes. An accomplished and learned rare book collector, he is actively building collections of classical Greek literature, focusing especially on early modern editions, the Plantin Press, and the legacy of Hellenism in the United States. Mark is an alumnus of the Johns Hopkins University, where he studied economics before earning an MBA and a JD from Stanford University. Mark is currently Associate Research Fellow at the Virginia Fox Stern Center for the History of the Renaissance Book at his alma mater, Johns Hopkins. His bibliographical and book historical research applies the tools he developed in his professional practice to Christophe Plantin's business records, examining Plantin's operations and the economics of Renaissance publishing and printing from the perspective of modern business strategy. We are delighted to have Mark deliver the Kenneth Karmiole Lecture here at Rare Book School. Please join me in warmly welcoming him.
Well, thanks a lot, Michael, for that very generous introduction. I am really impressed with the turnout today, given the weather. Thank you. This is a risky decision to make. And I also understand that there are quite a few people on Zoom at the moment watching this as well. And I have it on authority that they extend all the way west to Menlo Park, California. So thank you for joining us here in Charlottesville. I'd like to explore a less common perspective on a familiar story. We've all heard how printing accelerated the forces of the Renaissance and the Reformation. A printing press could produce many, many more copies of a book in the time that a scribe could produce just one. It's a familiar story, but an important part is usually left out. Printing didn't just improve productivity. It also created a big new problem: publishing risk. A scribe copying a manuscript took virtually no business risk at all. Normally, this client and the scribe agreed on the price, the work was done, the scribe was paid. Printing radically changed that proposition. To print a book, somebody, a publisher, had to put up large amounts of money. Cash was needed to pay labor and to buy paper for hundreds of copies. And normally that money had to be spent without knowing how many copies could be sold. Publishers took a business risk that was unknown to scribes. To manage that risk, a publisher had to judge what books would sell. And the publisher's judgment, therefore, became a gateway, a narrows through which most books had to pass before they reached their readers. To understand book history, I think we need to understand this gateway better. How did publishing risk affect what was printed? How did publishers manage the risk? I've been working with the records of Christophe Plantin, the greatest publisher of Antwerp's golden age. For a little under 4 years in the 1560s, Plantin kept detailed accounts of the costs he incurred printing specific books. To my knowledge, these records are unique. I don't think we have records for any other early publisher that allocate production costs separately to the specific book produced. They're a remarkable, you might say miraculous, survival to our day. I'm compiling all these into a computer database, and I'd like to describe that project. Let's look first at Plantin and the records he kept. Then let's look at his printing operations. And finally, business strategy. How did prices and costs behave? And how did Plantin cope with publishing risk? I'm going to start the slides here. Let me just get the mobile microphone going here. Is this on? Can you hear me if I step away? Okay, great. Now, many of you are experts in early printing. But let me give a little background so that we're all on the same page. Who was Christophe Plantin? He was a Frenchman. He left home in 1549 to try his fortune in Antwerp. He started printing in 1555. By 1563, his reputation was such that he could enter a partnership with some of the wealthiest men in the Low Countries. The partners put up capital, and they demanded that Plantin keep detailed accounts on a book-by-book basis. That's why we have the records. You could argue at the start of this partnership in 1563 that it was about the peak of Antwerp's golden age. The city's population had trebled in the first half of the century. It was now one of the largest in Europe. It was Europe's financial center and its wealthiest city. It was probably the most important port. And it was the center for Northern Renaissance art. That meant that Plantin circulated among artists like Philip Schaff. Humanists like Hadrianus Unius. The cartographer Ortelius lived down the street. Scientists like Dodoens and Clusius. He printed books or artworks by all of them. But the political outlook was not good. The Low Countries were Catholic and were subject to Philip II of Spain, but Calvinist forces gathered in the 1560s. In 1566, Peter Bruegel the Elder painted this. It's called the Sermon of St. John the Baptist. And if you look really closely up here in the brown cloak, you can see him. But what Bruegel was actually painting was what was going on outside the city walls of Antwerp and Brussels in his day. Calvinists and non-conforming Catholics called the hedge preachers who were holding services that were not authorized by the Catholic Church. In 1566, the Calvinists launched an organized wave of iconoclasm, swept across the Low Countries, destroying images in churches and cathedrals. The images in Antwerp Cathedral were destroyed on August 20th. This is Franz Hogenberg's depiction. There was tense political activity afterwards, as you might imagine. And as positions became public, Plantin's partners emerged as leaders of the Calvinist faction. King Philip sent the Duke of Alba and a Spanish army to take control. Alba arrived in 1567 and began a violent crackdown. Plantin's partners had fled by that time, and the partnership was dissolved. Having partners no more, Plantin stopped keeping the records. They end after about 3.5 years in 1567. So what did these records look like? This is the key volume, the cost ledger for 1563, 1567. It allocates individual costs to specific books that Plantin printed. Let's look at one of them. This, the book on the left, was printed in 1564. It's De Oikonomia by a Spanish theologian called Vicencio. The book is very much of its era. The Low Countries were highly urbanized, and urban poverty was a problem. The city of Bruges enacted a relief program, but many in the church thought that poor relief was a church function. This book is a polemic, accusing Bruges of encroaching on church activity. If those of you who read Latin will find some rather salty language in it, actually. Vicencio was not a quiet priest. But I chose this because the production cost is about as close to Plantin's average as I could find. On the right is the ledger page with the entry for this book, which I've identified with the arrow. Here's a close-up. The top part is labor costs. Plantin paid wages every 2 weeks. Let's look at the entry for the weeks of October 6th and October 14th, 1564. For each pay period, the ledger lists the specific choirs that were printed. A and B, the week of October 6th, and C in October 14th week. Payday cost Plantin 4 florins, 7 staufers. There are 20 staufers in the florin. And total labor for our book was 26 florins, 13 staufers. Paper costs are recorded right below. I'll clean this up and we'll look at paper. We see that this book had 18.5 sheets in each copy, and that 1,250 copies were printed. Paper cost 24 staufers a ream, and 47 reams, 10 hands, or 47.5 reams in our terms, were consumed. So the total paper cost was 57 florins, and the total cost for the print run was 83 florins, 13 staufers. So lots of detail. I'm entering all this into database software, not maybe the best lifestyle choice, but helpful for getting to the analysis. Data entry's been fairly slow, actually. There's lots of incomplete entries, errors, ambiguities, and so on. This presentation is based on complete entries for 1564 and 65. I'm now in the midst of 1566 in that task. So we're seeing today the results for about 100 books. When I'm done, we should have 200. So that's the records. Let's have a look at Plantin's business. Here's a 19th century photo of Plantin's printing shop after it stopped operations in the 1870s. In fact, we were having a conversation earlier. This is why we had these records. This was a going concern for 300 years. It didn't move and immediately became a museum of the city of Antwerp. So the records were intact. Plantin spent about 7,300 florins of working capital to print 100 plus books in 1564 and 65. You can see on the gray bars, he printed about 50 books a year. The red bars show that his costs were spread fairly evenly. This shows distribution of the books by genre. The gray bars are number of titles, the red bars are the working capital invested in those titles. Plantin spent most of his working capital on religious works, classics, and humanism. And while these categories are sort of a conventional way of thinking about that, I actually don't think they tell us all that much. A religious work could be a book of private devotion with a market of wealthy individuals. It could be a service book with a market of churches and monasteries, or it could be a work of theology, a market of libraries and academics. Those are very different books for very different markets. And I think it's more meaningful to focus on the markets. That's probably how Plantin saw his operations. So let's look at some other features. Language. Here we see Latin books were by far the most common, followed distantly by French. But what I think this chart really shows us is that Plantin was concentrating on the well-educated Europe-wide market. Latin, Greek, Hebrew could be sold anywhere in Europe to people competent in those languages. Retail price is another way to look at this. Here are the books. I've got price categories. These are my categories from 1 Stauffer or less all the way up to 15 to 20 Stauffers at the high end. The gray bars, again, are the number of books, and the red bars are the investment of working capital. This chart tells us a lot. Look at the money that Plantin was investing at the very high end of the market. All books were luxury goods, but 20 Stauffers was more than a full day's wage for a well-paid master mason in Antwerp. The 9 books in those 2 most expensive groups consumed nearly 3,000 florins of working capital. In other words, Plantin spent almost a year's worth of his capital on just these 9 most expensive books. Here's a sort from the cost side. On the left, we have books that cost less than 100 florins to print. That includes De Oikonomia. And on the right, those that cost more. There are only 23 books that cost more than 100 florins to print, but they consumed over 5,000 florins of working capital. In other words, Plantin spent 2/3 of his working capital on just 1/4 of his titles. And here I think we're starting to see some signs of how he directed his business. Luxury books were clearly a strategic focus. The commitment of so much working capital tells us that. These big bets on the high end could be called printing programs, multiple book projects that offered production efficiencies or where he could lever his investment of illustrations. Included here are the Latin Bibles of 1565, his books of hours, the emblem books of Sambucus and Hadrianus Unius. All of them fall into this category. So one strategic focus was the high end of the market. But there's a second very different focus here. Plantin betting capital on popular sellers sold at competitive prices. These are Latin classics that were issued by printers across Europe regularly. Virgil, Horace, Cicero, and also editions of popular writers like Erasmus. This starts to look like a second strategy. We can think of it as a price-driven turnover strategy. Sell faster and get the money back more quickly. I'll have more to say about strategy in a while. So that's a look at what Plantin produced. What do the data say about his printing operations? I think there are three key points. First, the printed sheet. A sheet that's come off the press, printed on both sides, ready to be assembled into a book. That's the central metric of the business. This one is an octavo with 8 pages printed on each side and was printed by the Plantin Press in the 17th century. The printed sheet was the core of the business. Production lists state the number of sheets in a book. Market prices correlate very well with the number of sheets in the book. And the two principal costs, labor and paper, increase directly with the number of sheets in the book. This point is central to the analysis. Just to offer some context, Plantin printed more than 1.6 million of these sheets during our 2 years. The second key point is that each decision to publish an individual book was a separate business proposition. This is because printing was not a capital-intensive business. A 16th century print shop might look like the beginnings of an industrial factory, big presses, workers in teams reporting to the printing house. But in fact, it was still a pre-industrial enterprise. And we can see this directly. Here are the partnership's costs in 1566. Fixed costs are the gray bars. Fixed costs are incurred whether the business prints books or not. They're costs like real estate. You got to pay for your space whether you're using it. Red bars are variable costs, mostly labor and paper. These were incurred only when books were printed. And the point of the chart is that variable costs were 10 times larger than fixed costs. Variable costs are what drove the business, and that's what made each book a separate business proposition. Why is that? Fixed costs were small enough that they could be carried, even if production stopped. The biggest costs, labor and paper, were incurred only when Plantin published a book. That was the critical decision. And that's when the business took risk. And that's why Plantin's partners demanded that he keep the records on a book-by-book basis of what he was spending on labor and paper. So the cost structure of early printing created an incentive to weigh costs and profit potential book by book. This cost chart also tells us the third key characteristic. The business lived or died on its working capital. Plantin needed a lot of working capital, cash, to print books. I like the sail on Chesapeake Bay. And there's an expression that a sailboat is a hole in the water into which you pour money. It's actually been disturbingly true in my experience. It was very similar in printing, and Plantin used a very similar metaphor. He described printing as a chasm into which he cast his resources. That's why he entered the partnership. He needed a pile of cash to get going. He had to spend a lot, and then he needed to get cash back from sales to keep the business alive. So that's the nature of the business. If the decision to print each book is a separate business proposition, what does the proposition look like? This is a break-even chart for our sample book, the Oikonomia. So we have money, florins on the vertical axis, and number of copies sold on the horizontal. This red line is the cost of printing. It's just under 84 florins. We saw that number when we were looking at the ledger. It is flat because it doesn't change with sales. That's been incurred. This is the starting point of going to the market. Book has been printed. Revenue is this line. He sold this book for 3 Staufers a copy, and revenue would increase as he sold all the way up, if he got there, to $1,250 in a print room. The line's costs at $558. That's break even. If he could sell 558 copies, he'd get his money back, and he'd start being in the black, bringing money in with every further sale. But if he didn't do that, he'd be in the red, and he would have lost money on his investment of working capital. So for each book, a printer had to estimate the market for the book and decide how far it was possible to get out on this line, and therefore whether to print the book. And so that's the last piece of the puzzle before we can investigate strategy. How did the market work? Let's move on to that. The price of the book didn't have a lot to do with its contents. The price was driven by a book's physical features. The key indicator was the number of sheets it contained. Here's what my database shows. It's a scatter chart of books where I have price information. This axis is the price of the book in Stauffer's per copy, and this is the number of sheets that the book contains. The black line shows roughly, that's fitted by eye. I'll do the formal regression after the database is complete. But it shows rather clearly, actually, how prices in the market that Plantin set increase with the number of sheets. So why is this? Why should the market value be based on the number of sheets? Well, I think there's two factors. One's the cost structure of printing, and the other is competition, particularly the ease with which competitors could copy the book and print it themselves. On cost structure, we've seen how labor and paper drive costs. Both of them increase directly with the number of sheets. To add more sheets, you need to buy more paper and pay more labor. Any business needs to recover its costs, so the price of a book basically has to increase with the number of sheets. Costs set a floor beneath Plantin's price. But they also govern the actions of other printers. Their costs set the threshold price at which they were willing to enter the market in competition with Plantin. You can see the concept with a build on this chart. The black line, again, a rough view of Plantin's prices. Prices go up with the number of sheets. Since costs also go up with the number of sheets, we can imagine another line, the red one, at some distance below the price to chart the costs. So the black line is prices, the red line is the cost, particularly costs of other printers who might consider entering the market. The competitors won't copy the book if they have to sell at a price that's too close to their own costs. So there's a zone above the competitor's cost where it's safe for Plantin to price. That zone might look like the pink area I've drawn on the chart. What does that mean? Well, if I'm right, then the upper limit on Plantin's pricing, the price he has to stay under if he doesn't want competitors to jump in, was also driven by the number of sheets. So we have a situation because competitors could enter easily. International copyright protection was 300 years in the future. And so in the Europe-wide market, there was nothing to stop another printer from printing a copy of the book, having his compositors send it, and putting it out in the marketplace. Plantin himself did this many times. In fact, Plantin was so careful with this that he would record the cost of the book he bought to copy in the cost ledger. I practiced law for nearly 40 years. My experience has been that businesses doing something they think is wrong and illegal normally don't keep very good records about it. So what kept competitors out was not the law, it was their own costs. They'd probably hold off if Plantin stayed close to a normal price per sheet, but if he went higher, they would enter the market at underpricing. So market discipline, the upper boundary, was set by the number of sheets. So taking a step back, number of sheets creates both a floor and a ceiling for Plantin's pricing. Price too low, you go out of business. Price too high, you prompt all this competition. This starts to look like a modern commodity market, like the market for oil, the market for copper. High prices bring more production onto the market and drive prices back down again. So what incentive does this create? It was probably smart to be conservative in selecting titles. We might have this romantic kind of modern image in our minds where publishers compete to find a great new author. I mean, I think about the movie a few years ago where Max Perkins, Genius, where Max Perkins takes a chance on Tom Wolfe and publishes Look Homeward, Angel. I don't know if that image is really true in modern times, but it certainly looks like it was not true in Plantin's time. Even if he was lucky enough to find a hot title, another printer could just come in, copy it, and print it as well. A business can take high risks only if those risks might offer high returns. And that would be really hard to do in a market like this. So it was reasonable to be conservative. Print works with known demand and price them in the normal range. A steady turnover of books, not looking for big returns on one book, was a sensible strategy. And this would tend to drive title selection toward known works. I don't want to overstate this. I mean, the competitor also had to assess risk, including the risk of getting into the market too late. And Plantin did invest money in new titles. In fact, De Oikonomia, our example, is one of those. But I suspect that the broader incentive was to be conservative, to anticipate competition, and to price to avoid it. So after all these charts, where are we? We've looked at Plantin's books, seen a focus on the Europe-wide market. We've seen his operations, that they were driven by two big variable costs, labor and paper, and the key decision was whether to undertake those two costs. And we looked at the market where it's difficult to sustain high prices because other printers could just jump in and copy books. So how did he deal with this? How did he manage publishing risk? I'm going to lay out three different approaches I've seen so far. One way to reduce risk is to reduce the amount that you're risking. Plantin did this by sharing risk with other publishers. Usually he would pre-sell a part of the print run at a deep discount. The other publisher might sell those copies under his own name. Plantin did that with De Oikonomia. He sold 400 copies in advance to a publisher in Paris. That helped a lot on the break even, as you might imagine. So here's the break even again, adjusted for the pre-sale. I've grayed out the old lines and drawn in bold the new ones. Plantin sold 400 copies for about 40 florins. That brought his cost down from that 84 number to more like 45. That's the new red line, again, flat across the chart. That left him with 850 copies. So the lines end here. He has basically given up this part of the curve to the other publisher. And it cut his break even to 300 copies. So for a book with uncertain demand, and this was a new title with an unknown market, this was a way to reduce risk. Based on the data so far, Plantin undertook some sort of a risk-sharing arrangement, usually a pre-sale, in about 1/5 of the titles that he published. Another approach is to focus on the lower-priced, faster sellers. Plantin also did this. He issued far more inexpensive 16 modes than other European publishers. This is a chart I constructed where the gray bars are based on the UTC, are looking at the Europe-wide market for different formats in a given time. This is for our 4 years, of course. You see that Plantin in the red, the market as a whole in gray. Plantin didn't play much in the expensive folio and quarto area, but he was way above the market in 16 modes. 6% of the European market was 16 modes. It was 39% of Plantin's production. So he sold a lot of his classics that way. He sold a lot of his popular authors that way. And that permitted him to underprice others and to get that money back fast. But let's finish by looking at a third approach, production efficiencies. The market sets a price ceiling, but the publisher could earn more if costs can be reduced. There are some interesting examples of this in those high-end investments that we looked at the beginning. I'll show you the Latin Bibles of 1565 and the emblem book of Hadrianus Junius. And I promise there'll be some book pictures along with the charts and split them. So the Latin Bible of 1565. Plantin printed 2 Bibles that year in Latin, an octavo and a 16mo. This is the title page of the octavo. The 2 Bibles were a huge investment. You can see that here. The octavo in red, the 16mo in yellow, account for more than a quarter of a full year's working capital. The reason the books cost so much is a large number of sheets they contain. 69 for the octavo, 111 for the 16mo. They also cost a lot because Plantin printed a lot. He printed 2,000 copies of the octavo, which is a really big number for him. And beyond that, he positioned the octavo at the high end by using expensive paper, some of the most expensive paper in the database. He also asked a high price for it, 18 Staufers. That put the octavo way out of price distribution. It's one of the 3 highest prices in their data. So how does all that look on a break-even chart? This is for the octavo, and it's not exciting. Plantin would break even if half the copies were sold. At best, this was an ordinary opportunity. But is that good risk management? He bet 900 florins on this book. That's an awfully big position for a proposition that's just ordinary. And he had to sell 1,000 copies at a very high price to get his money back. So why was he willing to do this? Here's where we see him getting creative. He didn't just print the octavo. He also printed the 16mo, and he printed the 2 at the same time. Here's the cost ledger. The octavo's on the top, the 16mo's on the bottom. Here's a close-up. Look at the dates. The first pay period for the octavo was July 1st, 1564. The 16mo first pay period was a little more than a week later, the 9th of July, 1564. The compositors first set the type for the octavo, and then when the sheet was printed, they didn't distribute the type back to the cases. They split the composition into pieces and reset the same text in the 16mo form and handed that off to the printers. So 2 books from 1 round of composition. You can track progress on the octavo first and then in the 16mo straight through the records. You can also see it by looking at the books themselves. This is the first page of the Psalms in both of them. Note that the octavo, by the way, is printed in columns. Here's a close-up of the octavo on top. As you can see, the main text is identical. The same initial capital, the same set type. The same blocks of type were used for both books. So what kind of an opportunity did this create? Let's look at the break-even for the 16mo. This is very good. Plantin could get his money back if he sold just 38% of his copies. And he sweetened the deal further by printing extra copies of popular sellers like the New Testament, Psalms, Proverbs. Those could be sold to readers who could not afford the whole set and in a somewhat inexpensive 16mo format. So Plantin created a multi-dimensional project from a single composition of type. The octavo by itself looks risky, but it was just the flagship. He created a whole fleet of opportunities around it. Let's look at one final high-end strategy, illustrated books. These were a strategic priority for Plantin, and it makes sense. They commanded higher prices. And Antwerp's pool of artists and engravers was second to none in Europe. This is the 1565 emblemata of the humanist Hadrianus Unius. Look at the emblem page on the right. Plantin used woodblock technology in the 1560s, and the illustration blocks for this book survive in the museum. This is the block that produced that image, magnified. The book contains 58 of these. The illustrations are the centerpiece, but illustrations are expensive. Labor and paper were the main costs for textual books, but that was not true for illustrated books. Here are the costs for the 1565 emblemata. The illustrations are about 75 florins, and they dwarf labor and paper. Plantin had to pay the artists to produce the illustration in the first place, Geoffrey Ballon and Peter Howes in this case. And then skilled wood carvers. This was the most expensive step to produce the block. Gerard von Kappen and Arnold Nicolay cut these. Blocks were expensive, but they were also reusable. So this chart is actually kind of misleading. The illustration cost looms large compared to labor and paper for a single printing, but the blocks are best seen as an investment. The same blocks could be used for reprints, for translations, and for later editions. It's clear that Plantin was planning multiple printings of this book from the start. Here I have a side-by-side of the 1565 octavo and a later Latin printing 1569 16mo. Let's look inside. The same illustration block was used, the blocks were used in both books. Plantin printed the octavo first, but commissioned blocks sized to preserve his option to put them out in 16mo as well. So how did this look from a risk management perspective? Here's the break-even chart for the first printing, the 1565 octavo. I've reflected the entire cost of the illustrations here. Plantin would get his money back, including the illustrations, if he sold just over half of the print run. This is risky by itself, although in the event, it turned out he did very well on this because he brought out another octavo the next year. So this actually sold very well. And that's where the money really starts appearing. Here's the break even for the 1566 octavo. With the illustration costs already covered, this is a real money-making proposition. After the two octavos, he printed 16mos in Dutch and French in 1567, the Latin 16mo we saw in 1569, and kept printing editions all the way out to 1585. Here again, we see Plantin from one investment creating a suite of profitable books. So this brings us full circle. I said we should look into economics to understand how books pass through the judgment of a publisher, understanding better the historical impact of printing. And here's an example. Plantin was looking to make more money on his illustrations. Publishing a Dutch humanist work in Dutch probably sounded like a pretty good bet, but it was novel. Emblems had been popular mostly with humanists who could read Latin. In a sense here, Plantin created the vernacular emblem book. And after Plantin, emblems took off in Dutch literature. They illustrated matters like folk proverbs and everyday life. And from a historical perspective, this was at the same time Dutch people were forming a sense of national identity as they were fighting a war of independence against Spain. Vernacular literature played a significant role in that, and emblems were not a tiny part of the vernacular literature. Some Dutch historians credit Plantin for kicking all this off, and much of his motive was probably economic. So that's what I have for you today. The project is ongoing. I still have a lot of data entry and a lot of analysis to do, and I hope there'll be some more results to come in the future. And again, for those of you who are on Zoom, thank you very much. None of us are looking for more Zoom time in our lives. I'm pretty confident. So thank you for logging on and staying with us. I appreciate it. I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mark. I do have a microphone that I would like to hand to anyone with a question, just so that everybody can enjoy the same experience of hearing that. All right, up in the.
Mark, first of all, the amount of research and insight to this is just inspiring and extraordinary. Thank you for this. And I think only someone with a background like you in international trade could have probably, in economics, could have probably carried this out. The graphs that you show of that break even, depending on the number of items sold, this is you seeing the economics in reading into this. Is there evidence that Plantin himself thought in those terms?
Certainly didn't draw break-even charts that none have survived. If he did, I'd be amazed if he had. there is certainly evidence of him expressing in correspondence with a potential author that he's not sure the market will, buy enough copies to make it worthwhile. And there's evidence of him engaging in all sorts of different efforts to get around that. I mean, insisting that the author take a certain number of copies at a particular price and resell them, that sort of thing. So I think he certainly behaved in accordance with the incentives that we see in the charts. If I spent more time with the correspondence, I have a hunch I would find a lot more evidence of him actually telling people that's what he was doing.
It seems to me from the evidence you presented about the creating the matrices for the illustrations for the emblem books, that we could think of it as he's creating a capital asset, and then he's distributing the cost of that capital asset over exactly 10 editions, 5 of which, that is to say half, are Latin, and 5 of which are vernacular. And so we could even see that as a kind of a hedge. 3 of those are Dutch, and 2 of those are Dutch, and 3 of those are French. So he's distributing the risk in saturating the market that way too. So you have this, and then that's not accounting for the fact that the capital asset that's produced isn't limited necessarily to this emblem book, because many of these emblem books use very, very similar kinds of illustrations. So I'm wondering if you have evidence that he's keeping a set of books on the capital investment he's made to make that, and if he's keeping track of the payoff of the capital asset, or indeed if he's amortizing the capital asset on the basis of where, because it's not an infinite, the matrices are not infinitely usable. They have a life, and he knows that very, very well. So I'm wondering, does he amortize the asset? Is there evidence that he's planning some of these additions more in advance, or that doesn't exist in the business records? And are there not multiple risk distribution strategies that have to do with a reluctance to saturate market and not make his break-even point?
Well, sort of maybe 3 points in response. First, as I was listening to you state with such precision what was on this chart, I thought, did I remember to click this thing the last time? The answer is yes, I did, and you memorized it all. So I'm very impressed. The second is that while these records are an amazing survival, there certainly are things that did not survive. He kept a journal of, it was called Shop Furniture, in which illustration blocks apparently were recorded. That is not survived. We don't know where that is. And, since illustrations are interesting, there's been a lot of scholarship about illustrations and a lot of hand-wringing that journal no longer exists. I would be surprised if he actually went to the point of a formal accounting amortization of the investment, because he didn't do that for any other assets that I noticed. The lead partner in his partnership came from a printing family and had lived for a long time in Italy and was very taken with Italian accounting. And in fact, the cost ledger that I use, which was in Plantin's own hand in French, was then transcribed by a scribe into Italian in a very, nice scribal hand, so they imported this guy from Italy to keep that. Even there, I don't see amortization. So it doesn't hit our current accounting standards. Your point about the reuse of illustrations, I think, is a very important one. And it's an area that I'm thinking about right now from an analytics standpoint. Some illustrations, like the emblem books, probably have fairly limited use. On the other hand, every printer in Europe probably had a crucifixion and an annunciation and a visitation and so on. So there's kind of a range here, and you could even take that all the way to initial caps, which they're wood blocks too, right? So he didn't account for that shop furniture to the extent we know in the accounting way, as I said. But I do think that the intensity with which he looked at illustration technology suggests that he may have seen it as a barrier to competition, something where he had a real strong hand. These records end just at about the time that he started exploring copper intaglio for his printing technology, which obviously produces beautiful illustrations in a way that woodblocks can't, although these aren't bad for woodblocks. And there's lots of technical problems, but we don't have the cost data for that to see. But I do think, and right now I'm trying to come up with some examples to sort of trace through the use of blocks into his different books, the more useful ones like the religious ones, and kind of see if that can be recreated. And I don't know the answer to that. In fact, I'm sitting in the Morgan Library from time to time looking at the Dutch Bible, 1570 something, I can't remember, where he did use a number of the blocks that he had in earlier 1560s productions, to try to see if I can come up with some sort of a handle on this.
So much. You talked a bit about how Plantin was using 16 modes and printing a lot of 16 modes as a strategy. And on the chart that you showed with that, it looked like he was maybe a little bit of an outlier in that sense, and that other printers were focusing more on kind of the folios, quarto editions. So was the thought with other printers to kind of go big risk, big reward? Does that kind of seem to be what I'm seeing there? Or were there other factors why someone might be focusing on the larger formats as their strategy?
It's a good question. And again, we're sort of hampered because I haven't got records of this quality, to my knowledge, for anybody else who was competing at the time. But by anecdote, I suspect that there were certainly printers who were focusing on large formats. I think of the Etienne press in Geneva as a prime example of that. And Etienne went bankrupt. I mean, so it's interesting result for that. I think that Plantin's work in 16 modes was pioneering, and the 16 modes became more common later on. You see kind of printers from his shop moving into other places in Europe and printing more 16 modes. I don't want to claim he developed the technology, he didn't, but his ability to produce them quickly and the workflows within his shop, which are documented, really. I mean, his house rules for printing, compositors had to have the proof available by 11 o'clock in the morning. Proof sheets were to be done by the printers at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That stuff was out there, and that's how they work. So production flow was a big part of what he did. And I think 16 modes kind of, I don't know if he grew out of that or he had that kind of rigor to permit that low cost, high efficiency production. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. Sorry.
Thank you, Mark. I am relaying some questions from online. We have lots. We're not going to get to them all, but there's at least a dozen questions here. So you've sparked interest. To try to combine a couple, one person's curious about book binding costs, and then we have another who wants to know, given the working capital, what happened with the one Hebrew book that Plantin published? Was developing that Hebrew type a huge risk, and was that countered somehow?
I had started as a bookbinder. He was in Antwerp for 6 years before he printed his first book, and bookbinding, casket making, that sort of thing was his profession. He did sell books bound as well as sheets, which was the more common, I think, for most particularly high volume printers like him. And there is even a Plantin binding that's characteristic, the collectors will seek out. So he's definitely into it. I don't see any cost records of the nature that I've been looking at for the printing operations on binding operations, but I'll be honest, I haven't really looked for it. So that there may be something there. The archive is huge. Hit me with the second question one more time, because the Hebrew, yeah. In 1560, well, first of all, the wealthy partner who led the partner group that funded Plan was Cornelius Bomberg. He was the nephew of Daniel Bomberg, the Venetian printer, who printed the first, there were a couple of different Talmuds which he produced that were the first. And the partnership agreement actually specifies that all of Plantin's shop equipment is contributed to the partnership, including his matrices and punches and so on. And that's his, except for the Hebrew types, which Bomberg was contributing, and they were going to continue to belong to Bomberg. I think that Bible is something that is worthy of study, and I've sort of started that as well. This is what distracts me from data entry, by the way. Because he also printed that in multiples. He printed a quarto, an octavo, and a 16mo. And he did it all with the same type. When you think about it, the type in a quarto and the type in a 16mo normally would be differently sized. But because Hebrew composition was so expensive, the amount he paid that compositor to set that book was far in excess of what you would get if you were composing Latin. He wanted to capture that value in multiple formats. And I think there's an interesting analysis to be done. You're sort of giving up a lot of the cost advantage of a 16mo if you use the same size type that you did in the octavo, because you're consuming a lot of paper that you don't need to consume if you used a smaller font. And the trade-off there between paper consumption and composition costs, I think, is be a very interesting one to look at.
This relates to a bit to an earlier question. Do I understand correctly that then question is, did they use different formats as a way of saving money?
I mean, Plantin did that to others regularly. He did a lot of copying, and he frequently did it to bring out a 16mo when he was competing against a quarto or an octavo. So it certainly happened in that direction. It's not something I've tried to study in the other direction, but it's an interesting question. The book I bought at the New York Book Fair this year is actually an emblem book printed in Rome. It's called the Centum Fabulae, which basically it's a translation of Latin verse of Aesop with illustrations, beautiful quarto, illustrations by the workshop of Titian and so on. The reason I bought it is that Plantin knocked it off 2 years later. It came in this nice quarto. He paid Peter van der Borscht to copy the illustrations into something he could put into a 16mo. And he simplified the compositions and so on to do that. And then he came out, and I just gave a presentation to Hopkins people, putting the quarto on the table and 16mo, and you could see, how he could underprice the Rome printing so easily with that. So it was definitely going on, but its prevalence that I probably can't comment on.
Mark, that was astonishing. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our Karmiole lecturer. Thank you very much.